For 2 hours, Johnny Carson gave the world a flawless goodbye. Yet the real, seismic event happened after the cameras cut, when he pulled a child's drawing from his breast pocket. The conversation that followed, ending with a 12-word lament to Ed, revealed the personal tragedy that fueled his entire career. The camera lingered for a silent, terrible beat, holding the final, etched image of the king of late night giving his last, practiced wave. Then, with a flicker that felt like the closing of an era, the red tally light on the camera dimmed, and the man who had controlled America's sleep schedule for 30 years was left staring into a profound, unnatural stillness. The applause, which had been a hurricane of raw, desperate love for 3 minutes straight, suddenly dissolved, leaving behind a ringing silence that weighed more than sound ever could. But what unfolded in the next 5 minutes, a conversation only Ed McMahon witnessed containing 12 whispered words, was the real final show, and it would haunt them both for decades. May 22nd, 1992. It wasn't just the end of a television show, it was the final, irreversible snap of the spine of American popular culture. For 2 hours, the man they called Johnny Carson had been perfect. He had been controlled, witty, and entirely without visible flaw. He had performed his farewell with the unflappable, legendary grace that was his signature, ensuring the final memory was of the showman, not the sentimental man. The studio audience, however, was a mess of raw emotion. Grown men and women were openly weeping. Every single crew member was fighting back the heavy surge of realization that this unique chapter of their lives was finished. The air itself felt thick with unshed feeling, a potent residue of history and heartbreak that lingered even after the final musical cue faded. Johnny stood there behind the desk, his hands resting on the worn mahogany, the same wood that had absorbed 3 decades of his nervous energy and countless untold secrets. The veneer of the desk shone under the remaining house lights, reflecting the emptiness of the seat where he had reigned. He could still feel the phantom heat of the microphone just inches from his mouth, the heat of the pressure he had just released. He took in the sea of glistening faces, nodded once, a quick, almost dismissive gesture of thanks, and then his eyes seemed to glaze over. He didn't look like a victorious monarch, he looked like a soldier who had just laid down his weapon after a very long and exhausting war. The king was suddenly very, very tired. The exhaustion was palpable, a weariness that settled deep into the bones of a man who had never truly relaxed for 30 years. A throng of well-wishers instantly surged toward the stage, led by nervous publicists and network executives, all hoping to capture the last fleeting moment of Johnny's attention. But he ignored them. He ignored the cheers and the final, pleading shouts. His attention was focused only on the familiar silhouette of his co-pilot, Ed McMahon, who sat motionless at his small, distinct desk. Ed was simply watching his friend, absorbing the seismic shift of the moment. Johnny's public smile had vanished, replaced by an expression that Ed had rarely seen, pure, unadulterated vulnerability. He saw the faint tremor in Johnny's left hand, a detail only someone who had watched him for 30 years straight would catch. It was the moment the mask didn't just fall, it shattered. It was the silent signal that the professional performance was over, and the man underneath desperately needed his anchor. The cameras were technically off, the audience was being politely but firmly shuffled out. Yet the most important scene of the night hadn't even started. It was in that moment of profound transition, when the bright lights of celebrity had been extinguished and the curtain had fully dropped, that the master showman let go of his public persona. He wasn't Johnny Carson, the icon, anymore. He was just John, and he had something he needed to say to his best friend. As the noise of the studio finally faded to a quiet, reverent murmur, Johnny pushed away from his desk. He did not acknowledge the tearful producers or the security detail. He began his final, deliberate walk past the now empty bandstand, his path leading straight toward the man who had answered, "Hey, here's Johnny," a countless number of times. The residual heat from the stage lights felt heavy on his face, a weight he no longer had the energy to carry. Ed felt a cold realization settle in his stomach. This was not the end of the show. This was the beginning of the secret. Ed McMahon felt a curious, awful numbness spread through him, watching Johnny abandon the cheering crowd to walk directly toward his desk. In the instant the cameras were rendered inert, the energy in Studio One fractured. The crew was left twitching with confusion, unsure if they should clean or weep. Ed realized this short walk was not about public courtesy, but private, terminal necessity. This was their marriage, the longest, oddest, most fruitful partnership in television history. 30 years of shared jokes and unspoken anxieties, always meeting again at 11:30 post-meridian Monday through Friday, a rock of stability in a constantly shifting Hollywood landscape. Now Johnny was finally coming home, but the home was closing forever. The entire 42 years of their acquaintance, from that radio studio in Omaha to this monumental stage, culminated in this single, final approach. Johnny arrived at Ed's desk, but he didn't sit and he didn't offer a joke. He simply stood there, resting his knuckles on the top of the desk that had been Ed's sanctuary. The gesture was one of weariness, a slump that the viewers at home had never, ever witnessed. His smile looked strained, thin, a piece of plaster peeling off the wall to reveal the bare brick beneath. Ed rose slowly. "Well, Chief," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That's all she wrote." Johnny nodded, but said nothing. He didn't meet Ed's eye. He seemed instead to be studying the grain of the mahogany desk. Ed watched the slow, deliberate movement of Johnny's finger tracing a small circle on the wood, a nervous tick Ed hadn't seen since their earliest days on television. The gesture was a silent admission. Without the camera, Johnny was rudderless. He was searching for the physical cues of his identity and finding only emptiness. The crew, sensing they were intruding, began to back away silently. The tension in the air was so thick it was nearly visible. The audience's lingering cheers finally faded completely. Only the faint whirring of the cooling ventilation system could be heard, a mechanical heartbeat in the sudden vacuum of the studio. It was just the two of them, separated by the physical barrier of Ed's desk and the invisible barrier of Johnny's guarded personality. It was the most private moment ever to occur on the most public stage in America. Ed finally broke the silence. "You know, all those years, all those good nights, I always thought that the last one would be a little different. A grand joke, maybe. You know." He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Johnny finally lifted his head. The look was intense, stripped bare of the famed Carson cool. There were no tears, which was somehow more unnerving than if he had been openly crying. There was only a profound, bottomless sense of resignation. Ed's heart tightened. He knew this look. It was the face of a man who was finally letting go of the one thing that had defined his worth. It was in that silent, loaded moment that Johnny slowly leaned forward, dropping the veneer of the celebrity icon. He moved close enough that Ed could smell the light trace of cologne and the faintest scent of whiskey, a comfort they both understood. This was the precise moment the public would never know about. Ed knew with chilling certainty that whatever came next would be the truth, spoken for an audience of one. Johnny put a trembling hand on Ed's massive forearm, his grip surprisingly tight, and Ed knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the public farewell was over. This private, loaded silence was leading to the real, seismic event, and Johnny was about to reveal the secret that had been burning inside him for 30 years. The final word from Johnny was not a joke, but a question, a private prophecy that haunted Ed for the rest of his life, demanding an answer that neither man was prepared to give. The silence was punctured by a single, ragged sound, a quick, choked sob that seemed to emanate from the shadows near the boom microphone, quickly silenced by a frantic palm. Johnny, the man who had perfected the art of emotional distance, did not flinch, but the sound seemed to act as a strange trigger, cracking the last veneer of his composure. He finally looked at Ed, and the look was devastating. It wasn't the look of a man saying goodbye to a job. It was the look of a man saying goodbye to the last safe harbor in his life. Standing before Ed was John, tired, vulnerable, and absolutely terrified of what came next. The space separating them, the width of Ed's desk, suddenly felt like an ocean the two men had to cross. Johnny made a small, almost imperceptible movement. He tried to reach out. His hand lifted slowly, tentatively, across the mahogany, trying to grasp Ed's sleeve, but the hand stopped short. It was the deepest expression of need Ed had ever witnessed from him. Ed understood instantly. Johnny had just lost his ability to reach out. He was physically unable to commit the sentimental gesture he so clearly needed. "It's all right, Chief," Ed said softly. He took the initiative, reaching across the desk and firmly grasping Johnny's hand. Johnny's grip, though initially tentative, became instantly fierce, an anchor against the rising tide of his internal panic. The pressure from Johnny's hand, the fierce grip of a man clinging to his only anchor, transmitted the full weight of his 30-year burden, the thing he was about to ask. "I didn't think it would be this quiet," Johnny finally whispered. He was talking about the vast, empty cavern that had just opened up inside him, the one the laughter used to fill. 30 years of noise, Ed. 30 years of applause filling every single crack. And now, he shook his head slowly, unable to articulate the sheer, overwhelming emptiness. "It's like walking into a cathedral after the sermon's done," he added, his voice catching on the religious weight of the metaphor. Ed nodded. "We heard you, John, every night. We were here." It was that simple validation, "we were here," that broke the unflappable king completely. Johnny's famous Carson cool finally shattered. His eyes suddenly welled up. A single tear traced a clear, silver path down his cheek, followed immediately by another. He quickly tried to wipe them away. Ed held his hand tighter, not saying a word, allowing his friend the private dignity of his collapse. The tear was the physical manifestation of the immense emotional pressure of 30 years being suddenly released. It was the cry of John, the man, relieved that he no longer had to be Carson, the legend. The legend was silent, but the man was finally heard. The silence returned, but this time it was shared, intimate, and healing. They stood there, the king of late night, openly weeping, anchored by the hand of the one man who saw past the legend. The only movement was the slow, steady drip of melting ice in a champagne flute left forgotten by a producer near the stage lip, a tiny, poignant sound in the massive, quiet studio. This was a moment so raw, so utterly without artifice, that Ed knew it would remain the most important moment of his life, eclipsing all the applause that had come before. The tears stopped as quickly as they began, replaced by the deep, complicated focus that preceded all of Johnny's most pivotal moments. He leaned in, pulling Ed close, ready to deliver not a joke, but a deep, anxious question about a future he was terrified to face. The tears were gone, but the raw, naked feeling remained. Johnny slowly released Ed's hand, his gaze drawn to the spot where his famous coffee mug had sat for years, only to find the coaster empty. It was a mundane, devastating metaphor for the life that had been swiftly and silently cleared away. The mug was gone, the cards were gone, the applause was gone, and Johnny Carson, the public figure, was suddenly adrift. He looked at the emptiness on the desk, and a flash of memory passed between the two men. It was 1950, and both men were young Navy enlistees working on a radio show. Ed, a burly veteran, had leaned in and whispered, "Don't ever let 'em see you sweat, kid, but never stop trying to make 'em laugh." That simple advice had launched their partnership. Now, 42 years later, the student and the mentor stood on a stage built entirely of their success. Ed, expecting a final declaration of friendship, leaned in. But the question that followed was not a joke. It was heavy, unexpected, and filled with a profound sense of foreboding that shook Ed to his core. "Ed," Johnny said, his voice now a fragile thread against the vastness of the empty theater, "when the house lights finally come up, what happens to the echo?" It was a question rooted not in vanity, but in existential dread. Johnny wasn't asking about his legacy, he was asking about his identity. Now that the stage was empty and silent, he was afraid the sound would stop entirely. He was asking, quite simply, "Do I still exist if the audience isn't here to confirm it?" Ed felt a surge of protectiveness. He realized Johnny wasn't worried about retirement. He was worried about ceasing to exist. The king of late night was revealing a terrifying anxiety about the empty years ahead. Ed placed his large, comforting hand back on Johnny's shoulder. "John," he said firmly, "you're not an echo. You're the whole song. And the song always finds new ears, even if they aren't here." Johnny gave a small, defeated shake of the head. "The song needs an audience, Ed. It needs a place to be heard." He stepped back, the vulnerability instantly retreating. The moment had passed, leaving Ed holding the answer to a question no one else would ever know was asked. The silence that followed was broken by a sudden, decisive statement from Ed, a reminder of a secret debt he still owed the man, which instantly shifted the balance of power back to the two of them. It was a reminder that Johnny's greatest generosity was always performed in the shadows. If you had the power to whisper one piece of advice to your younger self that would change everything, what would that private prophecy be? Let us know in the comments below. The question, what happens to the echo, hung in the air. Ed recognized the retreat, and instead of philosophy, he chose to answer with a secret memory, a quiet reminder of a debt that could never be fully repaid. The song never stops, John, Ed responded gently. It just changes instruments. And I know you're worried about the quiet, but you saved me from silence once, years ago, when I couldn't hear a thing. This was the mid-story anchor, the deep, sentimental truth known only to the two men. It was 1977, and Ed had nearly resigned after a disastrous business venture destroyed his savings and threatened to remove his family's home. Johnny listened to his confession in silence. He remembered walking into Johnny's dressing room, expecting acceptance of his departure. Johnny simply opened his personal checkbook and wrote a number so large it made Ed gasp. He slid the check across the desk. "This isn't a loan, Ed," Johnny had said. "This is a fix. You clear the entire mess. You keep your house. You come in tomorrow night and you laugh louder than you ever have. This doesn't leave this room, ever. Now get out." It was a moment of grace that transcended mere employment. It was a rescue mission carried out in total secrecy. It taught Ed that Johnny's true currency was loyalty, not ratings. Standing there on the empty stage 15 years later, Ed looked Johnny directly in his weary eyes. "You asked about the echo, John. The echo is every house you saved, every career you bolstered, every laugh you gave a person who needed it more than you knew." He gripped Johnny's shoulder again. "I always knew you'd be here until the end, Chief. You made sure of it." He paused, then added, "You didn't need the applause to matter. You needed the proof that we mattered." It was the greatest compliment Ed could give. "You let me be important to you." It was the perfect reminder. Johnny's true, enduring strength lay not in his jokes, but in his secret benevolence. By revealing this debt, Ed was giving Johnny the permission he needed to be human, to be John, and to finally allow the burden of the crown to slip. The burden was lighter now, but the stage was still too crowded. Johnny needed absolute silence, and he gave Ed a sharp look, silently asking for the one thing only Ed could deliver, the total clearance of the entire studio. Johnny had just heard the most powerful validation of his life, but the studio was still full of ghosts. He looked past Ed toward the control booth, and Ed understood the silent plea instantly. Ed turned. "All right, everybody, show's over. Clear the studio. Now, don't touch anything. I mean everyone. Go home." The crew filed out swiftly, leaving the famous Tonight Show set empty. The silence that descended was absolute. It was just the two men, surrounded by the physical artifacts of their legendary success. A fine layer of dust, disturbed by the exiting crowd, began to settle back onto the brightly varnished floor. The vast overhead lights, now just a soft amber glow, cast two long, exaggerated shadows across the empty bandstand, making the men seem like giants facing down a ghost. The absence of the audience felt like a massive, inhaled breath, waiting for the final, unscripted moment. The air seemed to hold the residue of 30 years of jokes, laughter, and anxiety, a museum of emotion being preserved in real time. Johnny, without a word, slowly walked around his own desk and approached Ed's chair. This was an unprecedented act. In 30 years, no one had ever sat in Ed McMahon's chair. Johnny gently lowered himself into the large, worn leather chair. He didn't sit like the king relaxing, he sat like a man seeking refuge. He looked out at the 250 empty seats. All that effort, all those years, 235,000 hours of my life just for this. He paused. The monologue, the jokes, the interviews. That was the easy part, Ed. That was the script. I knew the lines. He leaned forward in Ed's chair. "The leaving," he whispered, staring into the dark void where the cameras had been. "The leaving is what they didn't write a script for. Leaving is the hardest thing a man has to do." He finally looked back at Ed. "I'm scared, Ed. I really am. Scared of the quiet." He had confessed his greatest fear. that without the job, the essential John was unwritten, unknown, and perhaps even meaningless. Johnny took one last deep breath, then reached into the pocket of his tuxedo. The expression on his face instantly shifted from fear to a profound, long-held sorrow. He was finally ready to share the personal tragedy that had guarded his heart for decades. When was the last time you had to walk away from something that defined you? If this moment between Johnny and Ed speaks to you, share this story with a friend who needs a reminder that the toughest goodbyes are always the ones without a script. Johnny's hand went to the breast pocket of his tuxedo, withdrawing a small, folded, yellowed piece of paper. The fear of silence had been replaced by a deep, heartbreaking sorrow. The time for confession had finally arrived. Ed watched as Johnny unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, rendered in faded crayon, depicting two stick figures holding hands beneath a wildly exaggerated sun. The figures were labeled Mommy and Me. The artist, Ed instantly realized, was a little boy Johnny had lost decades earlier. The paper, frail and thin, felt heavier than any Tonight Show contract. Johnny had never spoken of this burden on air. He had bottled the agony, and the pressure generated by that immense personal sadness was what fueled the controlled perfection of Carson the King. The stage was his emotional shield. "I kept him with me, Ed," Johnny murmured. "I felt his heart right here, beating with mine, every single time I did the monologue." He tapped his breast pocket. "When the laughter got loud enough, I could almost forget the silence back then. Almost," he added, his voice catching. "I performed for him, Ed. Every single night, I performed for the boy who wasn't there." He recounted the single, devastating detail of that final day. His son had expressed a fear that he wouldn't be remembered, that he hadn't made a difference. The revelation hit Ed with staggering force. Johnny Carson was haunted by the fear that his own child believed he hadn't mattered. This explained the detachment and the relentless drive for external validation. Johnny laid the drawing on Ed's desk. "That's what this whole operation was, Ed. It was all noise to drown out one little boy's voice asking, 'Do I matter?'" He looked at Ed. "I built an empire proving to myself that I mattered, but I never let myself matter to anyone who wasn't on the script." The confession hung there, the terrible secret burden of the king. He had carried the central emotional ache of his life locked inside his breast pocket. The stage was silent, the secret was exposed, and the fear was named. Johnny leaned in again, closing the distance between them entirely, ready to deliver the final, profound 12 words that would define the rest of his life. The yellowed drawing lay on the desk. Ed simply reached out, his large, steady hand resting gently on Johnny's shoulder, communicating total acceptance. It was the only permission Johnny needed to speak the final truth. Johnny leaned in. He took a single, shuddering breath. The studio was so silent, Ed could hear the slight rustle of the ancient yellow paper tucked into Johnny's pocket, the only sound accompanying the king's final descent into honesty. He closed his eyes, ready to receive the penance, and then Johnny delivered the 12 words. "I only wish I could have stayed home, and it just mattered to him." The words were spoken in the cracked, rough voice of John, the father. The entire structure of the king's public life collapsed to reveal the simple, profound yearning of a man who realized too late that true success had nothing to do with ratings and everything to do with being present. Ed felt the words physically reverberate. He understood instantly the full weight of the prophecy. The 12 words were a testament to the tragic realization that his greatest achievement was also his greatest emotional failure. Ed tightened his grip on Johnny's shoulder, accepting the confession, the pain, and the terrible honesty of the king's final, private wish. The silent acceptance completed the confession. Ed slowly pulled away, his eyes now falling upon the child's drawing on the desk, understanding now that this wasn't the first time Johnny had left a sentimental note meant only for him. The final 12 words hung in the empty space. Ed simply pulled back his hand, a single, deep nod conveying total understanding. He felt the cold, familiar dread dissipate, replaced by a quiet, fierce tenderness for his friend. Ed's eyes fell to the child's drawing resting on the desk. The memory of the first time flashed into Ed's mind. 10 years earlier, Johnny had handed him a small, sealed envelope containing the sentence, If I ever forget what matters, remind me of this. Now, in the silent, darkened Studio One, Ed finally understood. The note from 1982 was a direct prophecy of this moment. The meaning was clear. The show was the elaborate route Johnny took to avoid his pain. Ed slowly reached across and placed his hand over the child's drawing. "John," he said, "you mattered to me. Every day, and that mattered to millions of others, even if they didn't know why." He was affirming that the public success Johnny scorned was, in a strange, circular way, the only possible outcome for a man driven by such deep, secret longing. Johnny, still seated in Ed's chair, managed a small, genuine, and devastatingly sad smile. The king of late night was finally free of his own impossible expectations, but the cost had been laid bare on the desk before them. With the burden shared, Johnny rose from Ed's chair. He was ready to walk out of the studio, not as Johnny Carson the legend, but as John, the man who had simply done his best, prepared to face the quiet. The moment of confession was over. Johnny rose slowly, the cathartic release visible in his posture. He gently picked up the child's drawing and tucked it back into his breast pocket. Only this time, it was a memory, not a secret. He turned to Ed. "I suppose that means I owe you a scotch, Ed," he said, his voice light. "I hear they stock the good stuff out in the prop room. A 30-year-long shift deserves the best, wouldn't you say?" Ed simply nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Only if it's top shelf, Chief. I earned it tonight." Johnny walked over to his own desk, gave the worn mahogany a quick, soft pat, a final goodbye, and then paused at the top of the ramp. He looked back at Ed. He lifted his hand in a simple, heartfelt wave. "One last curtain call for just us," Johnny murmured, his voice now entirely his own, stripped of the teleprompter's precision. "Good night, Ed," he said with the quiet tenderness of a close brother. The moment held, suspended in the amber light, until Johnny finally dropped his hand, accepting the irreversible reality of the silence. Ed returned the wave and watched as Johnny Carson walked down the ramp and disappeared into the darkened backstage hallway for the last time. What Ed McMahon did next wasn't planned. He didn't rush out to a party or accept the hundreds of calls waiting for him. Instead, he quietly went to the property master's office, took a long coil of velvet rope, and walking back onto the vacant set, he sealed off Johnny's desk and chair. He used a heavy brass padlock to secure the velvet rope across the desk's entrance, creating a barrier against the inevitable future cleaning crew. Ed stood there for a full minute, his gaze sweeping the darkened stage, ensuring the final memory of his friend's vulnerability was protected by a visible, physical vow. He stood sentinel over the sacred space where the most famous man in America had finally allowed himself to be just a man, shielding the quiet dignity of the moment from the network's cold machinations. The act was a profound, silent prayer, dedicating the space to the memory of John, not Carson. He left the desk exactly as it was, empty, silent, sacred. For the rest of their lives, Ed kept the secret locked away. He never once spoke publicly about those 12 words, but every Sunday afternoon for the next 13 years, Ed kept his own promise. He called Johnny, not to talk about television, but just to check in, to laugh, and to make sure that the echo, the sound of John's human voice, was still there, loud and clear. The final 12 words were meant for the heart of one friend. Johnny Carson's final, true words to his closest confidant were an honest, heartbreaking statement of regret that proved that the man who mattered to the world only truly wished to matter to one little boy. The story isn't about the famous man who cried, it's about the friend who held his hand in the dark. This is the truth Hollywood refuses to acknowledge, that every suit, every laugh, every moment of fame means nothing when weighed against the simple, aching human need to be seen, to be present, and to be loved for the unscripted man you truly are. That is the only echo worth leaving behind. If this story of friendship and secret heartbreak resonated with you, hit that like button and let us know what you thought in the comments below. And don't miss any more untold human moments behind the legends. Tap the subscribe button now before you go.